But the other, just the more specific thing I want to do is something I've been putting off for several weeks. Usually I do this in January. January got away from me, February got away from me, it's now March, and I thought if I can't do it in the first month of the year, I better do it in the first quarter of the year. And that is, I just wanted to share with you what I do. For those of you who are new or haven't been around for a while, I have a bit of a tradition that at the beginning of each new year, relatively speaking, I share with you the titles of some of the really good books that I had a chance to read last year. And I do this so that if you're looking for something, if there's something you want to strengthen your faith, if there's something you want to dig into, maybe one or more of these will strike you. And I'm going to try to do this fast because I know the kids want to go and we've got a sermon to get to. But as succinctly as possible, I want to share with you the titles of actually 6 books this morning that I think you may find helpful and interesting. The first one was written by a guy named Jim Maxim. Jim is the president of the board of directors of Strategic Renewal. You know I'm a big strategic. We are big Strategic Renewal fans, many of us around here. Jim, Beth and I had the chance to meet him at a retreat last spring. A phenomenal guy, great testimony. But he has written a book called 21 Days of Prayer to Overcome Strongholds. Strategic Renewal has a series of these 21-day prayer books. And this one, I've read most of them. This one really, God used it just to really deal with some stuff in my heart when I read it a year ago. And so if you're looking just to accelerate your prayer life, but also maybe there's some stuff, and he defines strongholds as anything Satan does to sort of get a hold of your mind and heart, hang you up in your faith, to keep you from pursuing Jesus. This is a thoroughly biblical way or path, resource for finding your way out of that. There are 21 days of readings, they're fairly short, and then there's an app where he actually prays with you or for you at the end of each day's reading. And I honestly can't recommend this one highly enough if you're looking for something for your prayer life. 21 Days of Prayer, Jim Maxim, to Overcome Strongholds. Also in sort of that vein, and actually the next 3 of these kind of come at the same sort of issues from 3 different angles. Another one that I became aware of actually through a Strategic Renewal 6-4 Fellowship is Jim Cymbala's latest book called Fan the Flame. Most of you, if you know of Jim Cymbala, you know Brooklyn Tabernacle, you know Fresh Wind, Fresh Fire. Jim wrote this book in the aftermath. He pastors in Brooklyn in New York City. He wrote it in the aftermath of just the mess of COVID, and specifically not just what it taught, but what it exposed about our churches, about American churches, and about where we're weak and where we're strong and where we need Jesus to once again truly be the main thing. He writes out of personal experience, but if you know Jim Cymbala, he is thoroughly biblical. He's highly prayer-centered. He's all about leaning into the power and the presence, the person of the Holy Spirit, so that we individually, but then as churches, can take that spark of faith that's in us and see it fanned into flame once again. I loved this book, got so much out of it. Fan the Flame by Jim Cymbala. I can't encourage you, again, strongly enough to check this one out as well. Next one. This is one, actually, I think my dad gave it to me, and he had gotten it recommended through the ministry of Alistair Begg, and so I thought if Alistair and my dad both agree it's a good book, it's probably a good book. But it's an interesting one. It's called Being the Bad Guys. It's by a guy named Stephen McAlpine, who I'd never heard of before. I don't know much about him. But he writes, and this is the first of a couple of books on sort of cultural issues, but he writes about, just sort of traces, how is it that the church, and in our nation specifically in the church, went from being a respected, revered, obviously not perfect by any stretch, but an important and considered an essential pillar of society, to now those who are truly seeking to follow and worship Jesus as the bad guys, as the ones who are in the way of things that people in the world want to do, and how he says that may not be such a bad thing to be considered the bad guys, but there's an opportunity for us to show the world who Jesus is, even though that's the box we've sort of got to get out of first. And it's very practical. He specifically talks about what it means to be considered, to be a Jesus follower, but looked upon as a bad guy in your workplace, in culture, just how to respond when people are down on the church. And you can tell it's not a long book, but it's a really helpful, very practical book on standing and serving as a faithful witness of Christ in a culture where the church is no longer respected, or even in most cases wanted Thought it was a great book. I think you should check it out. Same idea, but from a different angle, is a book by Tony Evans. Again, anything by Tony Evans I think is solid. It's called Kingdom Politics. Some of you have heard of this book. I know some of you, I think, even went through maybe did a small group study of kingdom politics. But this is a book that I don't think anyone but, I mean, you may not know who Tony Evans is, but trust me when I say I think he's the only guy who could have written this book in a way that actually turned most people on as opposed to turning lots of people off. Tony is a faithful, godly man, teacher of God's word. And he looks at, again, the issues that divide the church. Really, he's looking at it from an insider view in the church that divide us politically, culturally, socially, but how we should live as citizens. And this is great because this is where the sermon's going today. As citizens of the kingdom of Jesus Christ. And what he specifically calls us to in here is to live our lives in a highly politically charged world, not as red or blue or conservative or liberal, but as kingdom independents. People who can go to the Word and say, what does the Bible say about this? And be honest about where that leads us. And he said that's the lens we need to approach, and this year especially, I think. And he deals with hot-button issues specifically that we would say are on both sides of the political aisle. But he challenges us to look at what's happening. Look at the next, specifically about 8 months, through a kingdom lens. Not a red one and not a blue one, but a kingdom lens. Actually, I keep saying this. Read this book, okay? Just get this book. Read this book. I think it'll give you something to talk about with others, something to think about. It was certainly helpful to me. 2 more real quick. The next one, I don't have a copy of it because I actually checked it out from the library, but I had known about it for a while. We can throw that next picture up there. It is a book called The Shot Caller by Casey Diaz. I love biographies. I love conversion stories. I'd heard about this one, and then I was over at the library where my daughter works, visiting her one day, and saw this was on the shelf, and I just snatched it up because I've been wanting to read it forever. But story of Casey Diaz. Casey Diaz was born and raised like a hardcore gangbanger in Los Angeles. Did it all, and he writes about it in this book. And ends up in jail, ends up in solitary for a period of years, hates the world, hates everything, nothing but violence. But then there's a woman, and he can't see her because he's in solitary. He can only hear her, but she begins to come and visit him. She comes to just that wing. She comes once a month, and at first he hated her and shooed her away, but then he started listening, and pretty soon in that cell he found Jesus. And now, then God delivered him out of that, changed his life, got him out of prison. Now he has a really active ministry of just going to where the hardcore, the most hardcore people like him, kids are growing up with the gospel. It's a phenomenal story. If people say the gospel doesn't change lives, man, read this book and you'll find out that it does. And actually, he's really pretty personable. I started following him on Instagram. I actually messaged him, and he wrote me right back, and so I was that was kind of cool. But I just love seeing what he's doing and the places he's going, and to see that, this wasn't ghost-written, something like that. This is a guy's real story of Jesus changing his life. So if you like that sort of thing, The Shot Caller by Casey Diaz. Last one, I recommend one of his books every year because I'm not a big novels guy, but this is the one series I will always read, Joel Rosenberg's Libyan Diversion. And I love these books because they're a great story. I think they're every bit as intense as like a Tom Clancy thriller, something like that, but also a very biblical message. It's right tuned into current events, to politics. This is like about the 5th one in a series. We've got them all in the church library. But if you like novels, if you like action, if you like books that you stay up way, way, way too late reading, this would be one by him. And actually, the series starts with a book called The Kremlin Conspiracy. Like I said, it's in the church library. So you can race back there today and get it if you want to. But that's the last one I'll mention. That's all I'm going to say about that. Boys